Ain't going back, not gonna buy into all that. Hey, ain't gonna hide, gonna let all the fear slide. Got mother nature, it's on my side. Got a whole lot of loving growing inside.
Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the New Now. I'm delighted to have Jonathan Zap back with us. Today, we are going to discuss skills for going down the rabbit hole. If anybody hasn't had a chance yet to read the latest article we've published from him or reprinted about Are You an Interdimensional Being? I highly recommend it. There's some amazing information there. In my opinion, it pretty much puts into perspective everything that may be required to make yourself happy, healthy, and free. And it's the skills that are required for doing that. I think that maybe many of us have been missing over our lifetime in the years in the last little while. Jonathan, welcome to the show. I appreciate your time here today.
It's good to be back, Lorenzo. Thank you for inviting me.
So what would you say, I guess, preliminaries, let's take it from the little to the big on skills for going down the rabbit hole, skills for, what does that mean for you? Let's start there. What does that define as far as what you've seen in your explorations in life?
Well, to me, these are some of the skills that any human being needs, and to the extent that they don't have them, will suffer consequences. And even if they're living a very mundane life, because at some point they're going to have to depart their body and be in a very strange idioplastic matrix, according to so much testimony and report and well-documented experience. And so if you're not a skilled rabbit hole navigator, you're severely handicapped. And after all, I mean, every single day as part of the human or even the mammalian life cycle, we're going into a rabbit hole called the dream time, of which most people just neglect and don't remember and don't know how to navigate while they're in it. I mean, I'm not saying that I can navigate it perfectly while I'm in it, but somebody who was a talented lucid dreamer would have more options. And this is especially a relevant skill because right now we're in a time, well, speaking especially of the USA, but similar things are going on in other countries, but maybe not quite as bad as what's happening here, where we have collective psychosis happening on the left and the right, where people can't even navigate what shouldn't be such rabbit holes. Of course, any subject, is complex and could be called a rabbit hole, but where more mundane things like elections and vaccines are also subject to people getting completely confused and misled and so forth. So then when it comes to esoteric things, where we are dealing with much more ambiguous phenomenon than the so-called material world, the opportunities to get lost are vast and multifarious, but there are very classic types of pitfalls where we don't have to know the specifics of an individual case, but to know that the ways a lot of people get lost in rabbit holes is they forget what's inside and what's outside. They confuse what's inside their psyche with what's outside. They become inflated by the contents of the unconscious and develop some kind of grandiose mission to save the world. They become deceived by charlatans. They become a charlatan that deceives others for sex, money, and power. These are such classic pitfalls that the rules of that there are some principles of how to avoid those pitfalls that would apply to a great many cases. So that's what I mean by rabbit hole navigation.
Well, that's an amazing definition. I've got lots of things going on inside me right now, as you've mentioned that. I've talked with people, and myself included, that have had all those delusions at various times. Wanting to save the world, thinking you can change everyone. Thinking you want to become a guru, thinking you want to become even someone that knows better for someone else other than perhaps what they may know for themselves. So, how would we develop these skills then? How would we go about determining for ourselves the best way to go down the rabbit holes?
Well, there's several answers. I mean, one starting point, there's a video playlist on my YouTube channel called Zap Oracle. I just discovered the third video is missing. I don't know why YouTube would have taken that one down, but it's called Skills for Rabbit Hole Navigation in Age of Metamorphosis. So the main part of it, which was filmed at Meow Wolf in Santa Fe, is maybe like an hour and 24 minutes. It's pretty manageable. And I go through a lot of the most important points. Another thing I wrote is called Carnival 2012, a psychological study of the 2012 phenomenon and the something like the 23 pitfalls and blind spots of esoteric research. Covers a lot of the same territory. That's also a YouTube or a Spotify or an Apple podcast or whatever. And so other sources or other answers to that question would be reading high quality material by people who really understood how to navigate the esoteric, especially the writings of Carl Jung. I would highly recommend, but of course there are others. And then there are as many answers as there are people out there, and more than that, because each person may need to discover several answers unique to their own situation. But having good allies, good people who are well grounded and good at reality testing, they can be like, dude, you're getting too obsessed right now. You're like, you're losing your reality testing on this one and that kind of thing. So the answers are basically, that's the subject itself, there's I won't give you a chance to ask any more questions if I keep trying to answer that one. So
okay, I mean, let's tie it in maybe a little bit to what we talked about in our first chat, mind parasites and vampires, because I found for myself, it is the mind parasites or that voice, which is the biggest trap in going down the rabbit hole, right? Confusing what is good advice inside you from what is bad advice inside you. As you say, the fear voice as opposed to the love voice is how I'll put it. But, there's probably, as Jung would say, the unconscious and the conscious and the confusion therein. So how would, I guess my straight question, would someone who's decided to go down the rabbit hole or decided to explore what's going on in the world, how would they begin to navigate the difference between, let's say, their delusions and something that may not be their delusions?
Good question. Well, it's one of the funny things about it is when it comes to relating to mind parasites and negative entities, basically every principle of having good human relationships and avoiding bad ones applies. So just like a bad people try and take away your free will and manipulate you and influence you toward negative things, so too with entities. If an entity, a higher class of entity does not want to compromise your free will, just like any higher class of teacher doesn't. They're not going to just dogmatically tell you what you have to believe. Now we're in the territory of a cult leader or a entity that's trying to possess you and control you, or a demagogic politician. Okay, it's just like Carl Jung said, ambiguity is the way of life, whereas George W. Bush, around the time of the Iraq War, said you're either for us or you're against us. So when you find characters, inner or outer, that are telling you what you have to believe and are doing it using fear to or greed to try and make you swallow that, then that's probably not good. So you can, like it says somewhere in the Bible, I think, judge them by their deeds. And deeds, of course, include words and thought forms as well. So if their thoughts and words are manipulative and trying to take away your free will and trying to take away your independent judgment, same thing like with evaluating a guru or a person claiming to have paranormal insight or esoteric insight, and is telling you to replace your judgment with theirs. Well, then they're not empowering you. They're like, I am the, there's so many like Adi-Da, it's just like, I am, whose constant claim. I mean, they would even have to turn into an acronym because he would put it in his writing so much of like, I am like the first, last, and only revelator to mankind, just like I have a permanent higher degree of authority than you will ever have. and it's heresy if you even think that you could have that. So when you see a person or an entity that's claiming permanent hierarchical superiority to you, that's a huge red flag. And also when you find a person coming along that immediately wants to take charge of your sexual energy, your money, this kind of your real estate, this is very questionable and should make you very wary of them. Same thing with an entity that's doing that kind of thing. So every rule of like how to not have a bad boyfriend or girlfriend would be the same rule, could be repurposed to protect yourself from sketchy entities as well.
Interesting. So obviously this is one of the skills of going down the rabbit hole, right? Like when you're exploring information, you're looking for, like, how would you define the rabbit hole? Let's go there as well. So what does that mean to you, going down the rabbit hole?
Well, the rabbit hole can be one way of defining the rabbit hole, and I also have another video or podcast called The Path of the Numinous, Living and Working with the Creative Muse. And this phrase I coined, the path of the numinous. Numen means spirit. So something's numinous just means it lights up with an uncanny significance. And then the idea of this path is this is how I follow the creative muse. It presents me with some numinous thing, and then I just follow that down the rabbit hole, the reality tunnel that you enter when you start to gaze into something. Though be careful, because like as Nietzsche said, if you gaze into an abyss, it starts to gaze back at you. So your attention on it can lead to breakthroughs and insights. But at the same time, I also have a saying, wherever you cast your obsessive attention, there shall you find weird patterning. Conspiratists take note, because the universe is interactive. If you go down a rabbit hole naively, you'll get false positives, and you'll be tricked by what you experience. So I think your question was, what is the rabbit hole? The rabbit hole is the object of obsession, and that can be good or bad. Like the most familiar one in most people's lives who maybe aren't into esoteric would be someone you're infatuated with. Now, that can lead to an enslaved or dysfunctional relationship, or to you being a stalker, or to all kinds of psychopathologies. But if you were to really follow that down the rabbit hole, which doesn't mean necessarily the pursuit of that person, but looking into like, what is behind infatuation? Well, it's this intense projection. It's often the person, if say in the case of a heterosexual man, may project what Jung would call the anima, or the feminine part of his being, his soul, onto say an unsuspecting beautiful woman walking down the street, and now he feels like, she was meant to be with me. We had known each other from past lives, because it has this mythic, it throws back this radar return that has like a mythic resonance of familiarity, because it's projecting part of himself. Again, that confusion of inner and outer we talked about as one of the great pitfalls. Now that can turn him into a very obnoxious stalker of this unsuspecting young woman, for example, in some very rare case that might actually be correctly identifying a soulmate. And then, but a much rarer opportunity that very few will take advantage of will be to like want to look behind the projection screen and be like, this intense energy is coming out of me. Freud noted that primitive people, so from tribal societies, had a different and in some ways wiser understanding of the magic of sexual attraction. They thought the fire itself was what was magical, whereas we inflate the haughty, that which we project that energy onto. But if we were to really follow it down the rabbit hole with great skills of discernment, and see that like behind that attractive person, they're really just a projection screen, that behind that is the phenomenon of projection, of my being missing part of my psyche that I feel I can only find in another person, and all kinds of interesting things. In fact, I went down this very rabbit hole and came up with stuff like casting precious into the cracks of doom, androgyny, alchemy, evolution in the One Ring, that looks into that phenomenon of where we lose our wholeness and therefore we seek it in another. Another one is called no Tristans allowed beyond this point, rethinking the Western myth of romantic love. These were all discoveries and things that I made on the path of going down that rabbit hole, not realizing that there was something beyond the person I might be obsessed with, and to see how that kind of projection and desire, where it really comes from. So that's what the rabbit hole is. It's that object of obsession that we have to pursue and go into it.
That makes sense. I mean, I guess, would you say perhaps to somebody watching that one of the skills would be to decide for themselves why they're going down the rabbit hole, what their end result is, what they're looking to, what their intent is. It makes sense. Like if you're going down the rabbit hole to find a soulmate, so to speak, or if you're going down the rabbit hole to find a way of making a living, if you're going down the rabbit hole to understand politics, would their intent, if people are intelligent enough to pick that up for themselves, be something that you feel would be good to maybe put into perspective for themselves before they even jump down the rabbit hole?
Yes, but with the if in your last statement there really highlighted, if they are intelligent enough to know what their intent is, because people often have a whitewashed version of what their intent is. So here's an example of a collective rabbit hole: QAnon, right? It's really a retread of an old anti-Semitic conspiracy, the very one that had 3 out of 4 grandparents escaping Eastern Europe with their lives, called this anti-Semitic conspiracy, that started a few hundred years ago. It was called the Blood Libel. This is basically a retread version of that, where you become obsessed with some group of others who are, feeding off of babies and this kind of thing. And so now the people who are in that rabbit hole, well, they have a very lofty idea of what their intentions are. They think they're there to help save the children and research and find out what's really going on. But actually, that they may be seduced by a collective mind parasites. And really, what we know from psychological research, when they've done research on what are the personality qualities that people who become obsessed with conspiracies, and I'm not saying that there aren't actual conspiracies, of course there are, and real red false flags and so forth. But many people become, we're talking about the more common phenomenon of people not uncovering accurately actual conspiracies, which are multifarious, but becoming obsessed with nonsensical ones like QAnon. Well, the personality trait that they found conspiratists most had in common was narcissism, because it's really this extremely self-flattering thing. All these so-called smarty pants who have PhDs and these so-called journalists and the fake news think they know what's going on. But me here in my trailer park, on the internet, I've done the research and I know what's really going on. And so it's very ego inflating. Now, but if you ask them what their intention are, I'm trying to save the children from being eaten by Hillary Clinton and this kind of thing. But they would have to be very psychologically discerning and have done the thing that very, very few people do, of shadow integration, to see what's really going on. If they did look into that, they'd see well, actually, I'm the one that's thinking about adults vamping out on babies all the time. That's actually content that's happening in here all the time. I think it's happening with John Podesta and Hillary Clinton and Tom Hanks and, all these improbable people. But actually, they're not walking around thinking about that. I'm thinking about that. But I'm going to project it, shadow projection, onto the other. So I think I'm the good guy. I'm trying to save the babies. But actually, I'm a person who's obsessed with creepy death fantasies and vampiric fantasies about babies and small children. You see what I mean?
I do. Do you think that comes down to the mind parasites putting that inside them and then tricking them into projecting it and then keeping them in their trailer park or parents' basement or what have you? I would say to remain, for lack of a better way, food for these parasites.
Well, in a word, yes, but then we have to consider that what we mean by mind parasites, which could be entities. It could be like what the Gnostics thought, archons, they called the masters of deception, that, there could be some parasitic species that's above us on the food chain manipulating us. But then we don't need to go there in terms of something as exotic as that if we don't want to, because there are all kinds of, the mind parasites could be memes. It could be internet tropes and things like that draw people in, because people have always been psychologically fascinated with like creepy things being done to babies and small children, hence Grimm's fairy tales, right? There's always like some witch who's inviting them into the gingerbread, house, and they're going to put them in the oven and this kind of thing. These are very classic psychological obsessions. And so therefore the mind parasite could be explained in a much more conventional way as memes on social media and this kind of thing. But the one explanation does not rule out or is not mutually exclusive with the other. You can have a more mysterious, unseen set of entities encouraging that, but then it works through the much more, ordinary means that we can readily observe of it being passed along on Facebook or wherever. So, but it's definitely looks parasitic, right? Because what product or service of value has anybody obsessed with QAnon produced? So if you think about, human energy and time is so valuable, right? I mean, we're the animal that's, creating most of the change on this planet right now, except for some viruses and stuff like that, of course. But just think of the millions and if not billions of hours of unproductive human mental time that people have spent on QAnon, and has one bad person been arrested because of it? Has one new invention been created? It's like, if you think of like calories in, and like what comes out of that, all that energy, it's absolutely nothing except maybe some like domestic terrorism and harassing certain people, and people losing all their friends and family because nobody can talk to them because they become the crazy uncle with this unproductive obsession. So that looks very parasitic, because most of the time it doesn't kill them like a predator would, but it's just draining their time and energy into a completely unproductive rabbit hole. To be fair, many rabbit holes have that quality. Like if you have an unproductive obsession with an unavailable person, then you can waste a tremendous amount of time and energy, not to mention the possibility of annoying or harassing the person you're obsessed with, because you have gone down the wrong rabbit hole.
Well, I'm just going to close my blind here. Obviously, the sun's coming up where I am right now. So give me one quick
Okay, all right.
I'm not
Sure. And but if you could very productively go down the QAnon rabbit hole by studying it as a cultural phenomenon and seeing like what, if I wasn't so busy working on my fantasy epic and stuff like that. I mean, I've done some research, but I mean, people are writing books, and I mean, I could be a person writing a book about the collective psychosis of QAnon and what's revealed, what's behind that particular collective psychosis. That would be a fascinating object of productive obsession for somebody who's looking to not just be deceived by the images thrown up on the screen, but trying to look back at, like if you're at a movie theater and you're becoming obsessed with this creepy movie. But if you really want to know what's going on, you have to kind of like look over your shoulder back at the projector behind you, out of view, that is throwing up these fantastical images that are obsessing you, to see what's really going on, to the extent that we can see what's really going on.
Do you think it has to do with the whole savior scenario, so to speak, people waiting for someone to do something for them? I've talked with a lot of people over the years that said, hey, have you seen QAnon? And I still get emails literally every second day with someone sharing the X-22 or whatever that supposed email related to QAnon goes by these days, about they're
not familiar with the X-22. That's a new one on me. That's an email.
Yeah, I can send you the link. There's a fellow that's been sending us information for a while on, and it's all related to QAnon. It's a different sort of email thread that has to do, draining the swamp, all that other nonsense. And, every time, I've mentioned in my emails that maybe they should stop waiting for someone to come save them, because no one's going to change the politicians. No one's going to change this. No one's going to arrest everyone. No one's going to throw all the pedophiles in jail and suddenly your life will be better. Would you think it has to do with, I would say, responsibility? Would that be one of the skills? Maybe, we'll tie it back into the topic of this conversation for skills going down the rabbit hole. How would you relate that, let's say, to personal responsibility for your life and what's around?
Well, I mean, essentially, what you see happening there, because QAnon, like so many other things, it could be even a multi-level marketing scheme, or a dietary fad or something like raw foodism or something. These things quickly become religions. Antiracism, according to John McWhorter, who's the Black professor of linguistics at Columbia, has written a very brilliant. His last book is called Woke Racism, and he points out something I've observed also, that anti-racism becomes a religion that where it's anti-rational and where things are considered heretical to even think them, can get you persecuted. So QAnon is a religion, and it's also said, like, if you were to really follow any archetype, it would eventually lead you to all the others. They're in a kind of charged energetic network with each other. So the savior is another archetype. So once we get past the child blood devouring witches, kind of archetype, which turns up in fairy tales and, throughout history, now we'll eventually connect with other archetypes like the savior, John Kennedy Jr., who's died in a plane crash 25 years ago or whatever, is going to come back from the dead. And I mean, there are all these people that were waiting at Dealey Plaza. They thought not only was he coming back to be Trump's running mate and all this kind of stuff, but that even his dad, John F. Kennedy, if he hadn't been assassinated, probably would have died in his 50s anyway, because he was in such poor health with Addison's and really horrible back problems and so forth, is still alive at over 100 years old, and he's coming back too. So we have, but is that more fantastical than, saviors that get crucified and come back from the dead? No, it's a classic religious motif. The savior who comes back from the dead to lead us. But the Gnostics, actually, the same people that talked about the archons, understood that this was a type of religious psychosis that they actually thought that the archons had contributed to. So for example, the Gnostic Christians didn't do what the conventional Christians did and do to this day. Jung, who was a Gnostic Christian, wrote about this in a book called Aeon, who talked about why Christianity produces a schizoid split in people, because you're always seeing an outside savior and an outside deity that's the summum bonum, a Latin phrase that means like the sum of all that's good. There's no darkness in God. It's you, because of original sin. You have the darkness, but God doesn't have any of it. And yet the phenomenal world, like, black widow spiders and praying mantises who bite off the heads of their mates, in the moment of orgasm. Well, that's a God thought form, right? There are dark thoughts in nature. But when you have a savior that you're basically abdicating the sovereignty of your own psyche. A friend of mine who's a deceased poet, had a poem, something line like, I'll have no priests and no magicians. I shall be my own king. The authority of the king has returned. If you want to abdicate responsibility for your own psyche, which anybody going into the Q hole, for example, is doing. It's just like, come, obsess me. I'm gullible. I'm like Little Red Riding Hood in the forest, carrying a basket of goodies, waiting for like whatever wolves are coming along to manipulate me. Then you will be devoured And I forget where I was going now. What was the question again? I probably answered it by now, but
I think
I
so.
lost the thread.
It's all right. I think it comes down to taking responsibility. I believe that.
Oh yeah, right. Responsibility, exactly. I mean, you and that I get into that in my document. For example, I mentioned before something like Precious falling, the cracks of doom, and Precious falling into that, and achieving androgyny. Precious falling into the cracks of doom, or something like that. It's easy to find, but the idea is for you to, if you are take responsibility for yourself and your wholeness. So let's apply this again to infatuation. If I don't take responsibility and own the entirety of my psyche, then I become like a half psyche, like a person who only has a masculine side, for example, and then will project his feminine onto a woman. And that's why we'd have, some square guy in the 50s would say like, and here's the little woman, my better half. Well, two halves don't make, you multiply two halves, you get a quarter, not a whole. So if you are going to not be a whole person yourself, of course, you'll become like a ring wraith trying to find wholeness by capturing somebody else. You see? So, so all these dark obsessions are definitely an abdication of responsibility. Oh, instead of examining the creepy, dark parts of my own shadow that's thinking about creepy things about children, I'm going to project it. I'm having Hillary Clinton carry all that for me, or the Jews, or whatever the bête noire, object of obsession is.
So would you say every rabbit hole then, it sounds to me, and I can only go by my own experience, perhaps every rabbit hole is a trap not worth going down. Maybe the best skill would be to figure out, not to go down that particular way, but to figure yourself out, and to see what's going on.
Well, but yourself is a rabbit hole too. But no, I'm all about rabbit holes. I love rabbit holes. So I'm not trying to discourage people, but I want people to be able to navigate them well and not be trapped and sucked dry by them. Because, and I know about these pitfalls because I've fallen into every one of them myself. I'm an obsessive. My life is all about going into rabbit holes, but I'm just learning to navigate them better. And I'm able to make my rabbit hole explorations productive. I'm able to make discoveries and improve my quality of life by going into them, and without having to disenfranchise all my friends and family like somebody falling into the Q hole. So, but it's mostly what we see is bad rabbit hole navigation, where people become consumed, obsessed, inflated, possessed, all that kind of thing. So, but I don't mean to pathologize or discourage all rabbit hole investigation. So if we're doing a book on cave diving, I'm just watching this amazing documentary. It's on the Disney Channel right now. It's a National Geographic one called The Rescue, where all these boys soccer team from Thailand were stuck in this cave. It was a completely impossible situation and unbelievable, even for the best cave divers in the world, to get them out. And so so rabbit holes, it's like cave diving. There's only like a few people on Earth apparently that were good enough at cave diving. There are a bunch of older guys in England mostly or something, who knew how to do it, and even the Navy SEALs couldn't do it because they don't practice in caves. So it's become it's always been a rare skill, and we see more examples of it done poorly than done well. But when people are able to do it well, like a Carl Jung, or somebody on the imaginative level, like a Salvador Dali or David Lynch or somebody like that, the results can be spectacularly valuable. So, here's a crucial thing.
Okay.
If you're not going into the rabbit hole with a strong moral stance, this is what Jung recommended, don't go. Somebody who's going to take 100 tabs of acid to just have a trippy experience and see what's going to happen, but has no moral stance of what I want to learn about my inner darkness to be a better person, or whatever your moral stance is. If you don't have that, you're just what Gurdjieff would call food for the moon. You're like food for the parasites. You're probably going to come out of there perma-fried rather than enlightened.
That makes
So
sense.
it's very important to have a moral stance.
Have some good intent, to have a direction, I guess, or a moral stance is the way to put it. So that's one of the skills you would say before you go in, is to have some strong intent. Like, what would you define as a good moral stance then?
Well, a good moral stance, and by the way, I just happen to be wearing a somewhat inflated tie-dye shirt with, it looks very shamanic, but, the shaman, which I'm not, they're healers, they would go into the unconscious realizing it was dangerous, but to heal a specific person, or to accomplish, get a specific vision about, what we had to do to stop the drought or something. But a good moral stance is basically the moral stance that people who come back from near-death experiences, people often say, like, well, I need to go, people in the 60s would say, I have to go out and like find the meaning of life. And really they had the question wrong, because it's life that asks you what your meaning is. But the search for the meaning of life, this is not a well-guarded secret. People who have near-death experiences and visions of very profound visions of various kinds, they all come back and say roughly the same thing. Like that the purpose is to develop yourself, to know like Socrates said, know thyself, become a more whole person, become more individuated, to use the Jungian terms, to become more whole, whatever you want to talk about it, grow yourself, and then to help other people with that, or at a soup kitchen or anywhere. So if I'm looking to like explore QAnon, but my goal is to understand collective psychosis, be able to explain it to people who are interested, to prevent it from like turning into another, Nazi Holocaust or something. Okay, that's the moral stance. It's not that difficult to find. One thing we don't run out of is the need to understand ourselves, a job which we can never complete. Because if I understood one person all the way, including it was myself, I would know more than any person that's ever lived. But I'll never know everything about myself, because that would involve me knowing all the secrets of the whole cosmos. And then the opportunities to help others are so infinitely available that it shouldn't be tough to have a moral stance.
I see what you're saying. So would you say that would be related to the spectacular results, as what you had mentioned before going down the rabbit hole? Like, what sort of spectacular results people could be after by having?
Yeah, I mean, if I say I want to invent a product that's going to have a lower carbon footprint but heat people's homes, right? I've got a very clear intention. It's got a moral stance aspect, and now maybe I'll come up with something useful because my intentions are so clear and they're ethical. If I just say I'm going to go to the garage, throw stuff together, and just see what happens, maybe at best I'll come up with like a steampunk sculpture or something, but I'm not going to like come up with a meaningful invention because I just went in there to like, without any kind of a plan or intention of any kind. Now, you can go in with a plan and serendipitously discover, just like NASA did when, the Apollo program, the Velcro and, all kinds of other useful stuff got invented in the process of trying to get somebody to the moon. You can have, serendipitous discoveries and so forth, but you should start with, if you start in it from a completely chaotic, bored place, I'm bored, so maybe if I take, a pound of mushrooms, something will happen. Yeah, something will happen, but it probably won't be anything good.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So to have some strong intent or a strong direction before you jump down a rabbit hole,
right,
then just to kind of go through it for the fact of proving someone wrong or proving yourself right. Like you said, the many narcissistic, let's say, inspirations or lack of that people could have for going down the rabbit holes, which I find is more of a challenge of falling down into a trap instead of, I guess, exploring that trap. Because we all know that a rabbit hole could go either way, right? It could be a trap or it could be an exploration. So I do hear what you're saying there. That's very interesting. What do you say then to the people that are looking to begin? I think we talked about that before. So let's say someone's watching this, they've seen all kinds of information. Maybe they've been sitting on the periphery, and due to the nature of the huge challenges that a lot of people are faced with, which seems to be bringing a lot of new, let's say, explorers to said rabbit holes, and they're not sure how to begin, what would your advice be to them?
I'd say, first of all, my guess is if anybody's watching this and is still watching, that they probably have begun, or they wouldn't be interested in this. They'd be out like, pouring through their books on double entry, accounting or something at the CPA school or something like that. They would be pursuing something else. So they probably already have started. And they're looking into a rabbit hole right now called the internet, which is full of like gems and poison adders and black widow spiders and like the whole fantastic variety of from lightest light to the darkest dark. And so therefore that's a rabbit hole in itself, and they're involved in like some kind of esoteric research, or they probably wouldn't be watching this, and therefore all of these skills pertain. As far as like where to begin, because sometimes I'm approached by people who have not found their great mission or calling in life, and there's kind of an irony and a paradox involved in their selecting me, because somehow they sense that I'm somebody that has that, which I do in spades, and it's like the best drug in the world. It like wakes me up every morning. I'm like so excited to get on with my life mission. Unfortunately, I've never not had that. I've been on like the same life mission and following out the same themes since I was like 2.5 years old. So I don't really, it's hard to help people understand a problem you yourself have not had, right? If I'm a recovering alcoholic and you're an alcoholic, I know a lot, but here's what I do, given the fact that like, the creative muse never leaves me high and dry. Like, I have to follow it into all kinds of inconvenient places, but the trade-off is the well's never dry. I'm always being led through one rabbit hole or another. But the method of beginning or finding one is that's what I call the path of numinous. Look for something around you that seems numinous. It seems like it has an uncanny significance. Know that if that's a physically attractive person, that's the most unreliable case of and the most common one of the path of the numinous. But look at it, but then know that like if you're not going to enter it with skills of high discernment and knowing your own shadow, then you're likely to get deceived there. You're likely to become like an obsessed QAnon person, much like the 9/11 truther or somebody like that. Oops. I think I lost you.
Yeah, we've lost your image. I can still hear you.
It's because somebody's trying to call me, and so that seems to have thrown off. Let me see what I have to do. Okay, I can see myself now.
Yep, you're back. I can see you as well.
All right. So, so it's very easy. So what's so deceiving is that a person who doesn't know their shadow. So this is really like the skill to precede any other skill is shadow integration. Because if you don't do that, you will be, it's like Nietzsche said, be careful in fighting monsters that you don't yourself become a monster.
Okay, so, Jonathan, maybe we can look at perhaps what I'm coming to a little bit of a conclusion is the most important skill for going down the rabbit hole, shadow integration.
Right, because if you don't do that one, then you're going down the rabbit hole, could have a body count associated with it. The body could be yours. It could also be other people's, because people who go down rabbit holes, let's remember, like Nazism, basically a crazy occult rabbit hole that a guy who was an unemployed artist, Adolf Hitler, went down. It looked like maybe he had a possessed by the demiurge, the head of the archons. He was going to the esoteric bookstore. He was doing research like the QAnon people talk about, and he was coming up with a crazed religion, where the Germans were the master race, and Jews were these diabolical and creatures, who were inferior but running the world, and so forth. So if you go down the rabbit hole the wrong way without having done shadow integration, he didn't see his own shadow. He let the Jews be he projected it onto the Jews. He wanted to have 1,000-year Reich, but he said they're trying to run the world. So then what you will do is you will end up fighting monsters, kind of like when Luke Skywalker goes into the cave and Yoda tells him not to take his lightsaber, and he says he's not afraid, and Yoda says, of course I find Yoda very annoying, but he says you will be, and he thinks he's battling Darth Vader, but when Vader's helmet cracks open, he discovers his own face. So you may go out there and fight monsters, but actually it turns out you're the monster. So if you haven't located your own darkness and you go into a rabbit hole, harm is going to result. So to me, that's the minimum prerequisite, is to own your own darkness. And when Jung was teaching a seminar in Germany, and there were like Nazis literally goose-stepping outside, and people said, given the great evils in the world, like, what can we do? He said, begin by first reclaiming your own shadow from the world, because virtually all violence is shadow projection. It's a guy who's mad at his girlfriend because of his own darkness. It's somebody who's mad at another race or group, and because they haven't owned their own will to power and their own dark impulses and so forth. So that's the source of all the violence and most of the terror and problems in the world. It's psyche. So as Jung said, there is no hydrogen bomb in nature. That is all man's doing. We are the great danger. Psyche is the great danger. And so if you're going to go into a rabbit hole without taking responsibility for your own psyche and your own shadow, there will be harmful consequences.
Yeah, I guess in some ways you could even say we've come full circle, goose stepping outside the door, so to speak. The
right.
nonsense that's going on these days, the finger pointing,
right.
Everyone seems to be, I would say, hypnotized towards, blaming people that have had a jab or haven't had a jab or are wearing a mask or aren't wearing a mask, and shadow projecting their own fears, let's say, onto their neighbor in relation to, fear for, I guess the big one is fear of death. That seems to be what gets pushed around the most these days, which seem to, as you said in your article, which Castaneda said, you look around this world, there are no survivors, right? Nobody makes it out
right.
at 55. So it makes sense if you accept that as a foregone conclusion. You live maybe with a little less fear in what's going on in your neighborhood or your friends or even your family or what have you.
Well, Castaneda is a great example because I call him the trickster genius, because he was a total fraudster, but Don Juan is one of the great literary creations of all time. I recommend the book by one of his closest disciples, many of whom have since debunked him, but this woman, can't think of her name. Her father was a famous writer, who befriended Castaneda. It's called The Sorcerer's Apprentice. That's the most thorough one that goes into Castaneda, the cult leader, and with all the sex, money, and power shadow, you expect of a cult leader. But Don Juan, the sayings of Don Juan are such fantastic literary creations. Some of them derivative, but still, it works for me as like a fantasy, a visionary fantasy work. His books. So he's an example of somebody who. What you often find is somebody who's authentically going down the rabbit hole. He certainly made some discoveries and was a real esoteric person, but he was also, a fraudster and a manipulator and abusing sex, money, and power and all that kind of thing. So there's a fascinating case, where we can't divide up people into like the good people who know how to be a rabbit hole navigator like me, and stuff like that. Carl Jung, but we have shadows too. Jung said The larger the man, the larger the shadow. He probably hoped that would be applied to him because he was like 6'6", and he had a pretty dark shadow. He could be quite a bully, and that kind of thing. Recognizing that, like, we will all be deceived in rabbit holes. We will all project and act out our darkness in the world. Start with that assumption, and be humble about it, so that you have some hope of not inflicting harm on others. Mm. And I'll just leave you with a great thought about that. It was some minister, televangelist, but one of the better ones, I guess, who interviewed both Barack Obama and John McCain when they were presidential candidates. And he asked each of them, what should we do about evil? And John McCain said, defeat it. But Obama had a much more thoughtful answer. He said, like, well, we should be very humble about it, and, like, make sure that like we're not the evil that we're seeing in others, that kind of thing. So that's more my approach.
Good approach. Don't be the evil you see in others. I mean, I've heard all kinds of perspectives on a lot of the topics we've touched base on. Castaneda, going to the moon, not going to the moon, what carbon means, what carbon doesn't mean. And I know I've heard a lot of opposite opinions to, what you've mentioned as what you've seen in each of those rabbit holes. Let's say carbon, going to the moon, round earth, flat earth, Castaneda being a good man, a bad man, a real man, a charlatan. So it's interesting to see the difference of opinions in relation to what could be real and what can't be real. So what I would like to say, and the question I'd like to bring to you is, how do you determine that? Right? It's like, I didn't know Castaneda permanent, I didn't go to the moon. I've heard, like I said, all kinds of intelligent perspectives on carbon and the topics you've brought up, where I know there are some of our viewers will have directly opposite opinions to what's been mentioned. How would you say someone can figure out for themselves what's a shadow and what's real in relation to something they haven't had any direct experience with?
Well, it's the question that has 1,000 answers, but here's one of them. It's a philosophy I created called dynamic paradoxicalism. Again, you could listen to it as a YouTube or Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or read it on my website. And basically the idea that is the opposite of a profound truth is another profound truth. And there's a dynamic paradox between them. Like, here's an example of a dynamic paradox. You create your own reality. That's true sometimes, but other times, the opposite is true. Outside reality creates you. And so instead of believing either black is right or white is right, or something like that, that you realize that, like, it's very context specific. Okay, so in other words, if I'm going to a party, with 20 people who I know slightly, well, I probably will create my own reality. If I think people are going to like me, or if I think they're going to hate me, I'm approaching a small system of 20 people, a social system, and they're the same species I am. And my thoughts about myself are going to be so highly influential, I'm likely to create my own reality. Or maybe somebody there is going to have a heart attack, and the outside situation is going to be completely determined by this outer event, and nobody's going to be having a good time. It's going to be completely, determined by an event that was completely out of my control. So you slide between the poles and know where one applies versus when the other applies, and you relate to them not as an absolutist, but dynamically. And so a good practice is to, whatever you believe, is to try and defend the opposite. So when I was 14 years old, I was on the Bronx High School of Science debate team. It was the #1 debate team in the country. But with any debate team, a coin toss a minute before the debate decides if you're arguing for the proposition, like we should have judicial reform, or against it, like we don't need judicial reform, the status quo works. And so you learn a certain flexibility of mind when you have to argue for or against. So if you're in an argument with somebody, instead of straw manning them, where you try and do things like bad rhetorical techniques like reducto absurdum, where you try and reduce their argument to some comic caricature. Of course, unfortunately, many people's arguments really are comic caricatures to start with. And, they've already reduced themselves to absurdity. But where you steel man them, which is that you, like if we're having an argument back and forth, before I can speak to you, I have to first summarize what you just said to me to your satisfaction, to show that I've really heard it and understood it before I can say what I have to say, and then you have to do the same thing back with me. So, so there are many skills like that that can help.
That makes sense. That makes sense. You look at both sides of the picture and you realize you could be wrong and you could be right. And, when you're integrating your shadows, perhaps that's the end result of the best skill you could pick up for going down the rabbit hole, is to know yourself, as they say, as best as you possibly can. And I would say that could be the best armor possible for any kind of exploration.
Right. Another one of those tools is skepticism. Now, the people who call themselves skeptics are usually the opposite of skeptics. They're usually debunkers who start with it, but skepticism was actually a school of Greek philosophy that believed that you should try to avoid coming to conclusions about things, because as soon as you do, your powers of thinking and observation diminish, which we know as a fact, from it's been studied endlessly by cognitive psychology, confirmation bias. As soon as I think I know what's going on, just like if you're going to diagnose somebody, of what disease they have, you're not supposed to jump to like what you think it is. You eliminate, well, it's not TB because of this, it's not AIDS, it's not, and until so you eliminatively, we did the same thing in gemology, the science of precious diamonds and precious stones, like well, it's a red transparent stone, so it can't be peridot. It's got an RI of this, so and so forth. So the skeptics, but by not arriving at conclusions and allowing ambiguity, you're not fooled as easily. And whereas as soon as you know the answer, now you're likely to become some kind of a ideologue or a demagogue, because the worst people are full of answers. It's just like there was that apocalyptic poem by William Butler Yeats called The Second Coming, and said like, talked about the apocalyptic time where the best lack all conviction and the worst are filled with a passionate intensity. So if you look at the far left and the far right, we find a lot of people filled with passionate intensity. They know they're the right ones, and they know who the bad ones are. They're wearing the white hats, and the bad ones are, they live in this completely unambiguous world, and they don't, they don't examine their own motives. And that's where we really have problems. So if you're a skeptic, meaning you don't, prematurely arrive at definite conclusions when you're dealing with an ambiguous, complex subject, then that's a great skill.
I would agree. I've fallen into these traps, all of them, many times myself, thinking I know better, or thinking I'm looking for something, or thinking I don't have a shadow when I do, or having convictions when I shouldn't have. So I would say that's one of the best bits of advice, on top of shadow integration, being a skeptic and, going in with an open mind, heart perspective, and, not expecting what you may or may not find, but allowing it to come to you, and then perhaps dealing with it in a loving but intelligent fashion.
Yeah. And, question authority. I mean, I speak in an authoritative tone just because that's a rhetorical style that I learned. But if it wouldn't be so redundant, I would precede every single sentence that I said to anybody with, "It seems as if."
Right.
Or, I would want to see scare quotes around everything that I said. Take everything I say with a grain of salt.
Right.
Take that which resonates with your inner truth sense and your empirical experience, and leave the rest. So question everything that I'm saying or that anybody else is saying. But people who are speaking to you in a calm and compassionate way are probably more likely to be reliable than people that are like trying to rile you up into a rage or, something like that.
Makes sense. To take everything with a grain of salt, figure it out for yourself. I like your perspective at the end. It's always an intelligent way to come to a conclusion going, I could be wrong for you, but I'm right for myself, and see what it is that works for you, and go from there. I appreciate it. Well, perhaps we've come to an excellent conclusion on this topic of going down the rabbit hole. You know, is there any specifics you may like to leave our viewers with from this particular chat?
No, because rabbit holes are endless. And so therefore the rules of rabbit hole navigation are endless. You have to have the you have to have the real-time intuitive global intuition to be able to navigate your individual rabbit hole without regard to a rule book or a formula.
Yeah.
Because it's the nature of rabbit holes to be encroaching into the unknown.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. This has been amazing. I appreciate your perspective. I always liked, well, we've talked a couple of times, and both times you've made some points I hadn't considered. So it helps me to understand my rabbit hole and what I'm going through. And if anybody has any suggestions or questions for perhaps through future chats with Jonathan, or if they have any questions for him, please leave the links below. I will link once again to Jonathan's videos that he mentioned and his website, which has much, much more information than we've chatted about in this particular topic. And like myself, I hope you guys have enjoyed this conversation and you've got something from it. And Jonathan, I appreciate your time here today.
Take care, man. Good talking to you, Lorenzo.
Thank you, everyone.
Can't make me lie to my heart. No one tells me where I should start. Freedom first is what I say. Nothing now gonna get in my way.
We're living in uncertain times. We don't know what's going to go on. Job security is pretty much out the window, dependent a lot on, the choices that you make and the information you want to give. So what are you going to do? Are you looking for something new? Are you looking for a new way to create wealth for your family that is, shall we say, Babylon proof? And on top of that, are you looking for a good group of people to work with, a good network? Because as we know, going forward, this is all about creating networks of people on our frequency who have the same morals and ethics and intent, and who all want to walk forward together and create something so much better. So if you're looking for some good products, a good business, and most of all, a good group of people, I think we may have found something you might be interested in.
You don't need to sell your soul to make a living. You don't need to sell your soul to have your family happy, healthy, and free. A simple shift in what you would like to do, the same amount of energy, and it can all come back to you. Freedomshift.life. Campbell did it, I did it. Happy to see you there.
Freedomshift.life.